Welcome back to Vietnamese Vixens. Today's story comes from a man who thought he'd escaped one manipulative marriage only to walk straight into something far worse. Marcus is a 41-year-old software engineer from Munich, Germany, and he's about to tell you how the perfect Vietnamese wife turned out to be hiding an addiction that cost him over $45,000 and nearly destroyed what was left of his ability to trust. If you've ever ignored red flags because you were desperate to believe in someone, if you've ever let loneliness cloud your judgment, drop a comment below and let us know where you're watching from. And if this story resonates with you, hit that like button and subscribe, because these cautionary tales might just save you from making the same mistakes. Now, here's Marcus's story in his own words. I landed in Hanoi in March of 2023 with 2 suitcases, a remote work contract, and the kind of exhaustion that settles into your bones after a 20-year marriage ends badly. My ex-wife Petra had left me for her personal trainer, which is such a cliche, it almost made the humiliation worse. The divorce settlement took half of everything I'd built. The house in the Munich suburbs, gone. Half my savings, gone. My self-respect, somewhere in the rubble. I wasn't running away exactly, but I also wasn't staying. A buddy from university had moved to Southeast Asia years ago and kept sending me photos of cheap apartments, warm weather, and freedom. When the divorce papers were finally signed, I bought a one-way ticket. Hanoi hit me like a wall of heat and noise. The humidity wrapped around you the second you stepped outside, thick enough to taste. Motorbikes everywhere, thousands of them, weaving through traffic like schools of fish. The smell of street food smoke and exhaust and something sweet I couldn't identify. Everyone kept telling me how cheap everything was, and they were right. My apartment in Tay Ho, the expat district, cost me 12 million dong a month. Sounds like a fortune until you realize that's about $450 for a 2-bedroom place with a balcony and a view of West Lake. My morning coffee at a street vendor cost 15,000 dong, less than $1. I could live like a king on my remote tech salary. And after years of German prices and German winters, and a German wife who treated me like a roommate who occasionally fixed the Wi-Fi, the whole thing felt like a fever dream. But here's the thing nobody tells you about running away from a failed marriage. You take yourself with you. I'd sit on my balcony at night, watching the lake, drinking cheap Vietnamese beer, and I'd feel the loneliness settling in like sediment. The heat was oppressive. The language was impossible. I'd smile and nod at locals who tried to chat with me, understanding maybe one word in 10. The other expats I met seemed to fall into 2 categories: burnt-out English teachers drinking themselves to death, or sex tourists who made my skin crawl. I wasn't looking for love. I was looking for peace. I wanted to sit in my air-conditioned apartment, do my coding work, and feel nothing for a while. That lasted about 6 weeks. Then I met Lynn. It was at a coffee shop in the Old Quarter, one of those narrow places where you sit on plastic stools and they serve you drip coffee with condensed milk. I'd gotten into the habit of working there a few mornings a week, partly because the coffee was good, partly because the background noise helped me focus. Lynn was sitting at the table next to mine, reading a worn paperback copy of Gabriel Garcia Marquez in English. I noticed the book first, then one noticed her. Late 20s, dark hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, no makeup that I could see, wearing a plain white áo dai that somehow made her look elegant instead of trying too hard. She had this quality of self-containment, like she was perfectly content being alone with her book while one did something I never do. I leaned over and said the book was one of my favorites. She looked up, smiled politely, said thank you in accented but clear English, and went back to reading. That was it. No lingering eye contact. No invitation to continue the conversation. She'd acknowledged me and dismissed me in the same breath. I sat there feeling like an idiot, and also more intrigued than I'd been by another human being in years. The disinterest hooked me. Petra had chased me in university, had pursued me aggressively until I'd said yes to a date. This woman didn't seem to care whether I existed or not. I started showing up at that coffee shop every morning. Lynn was there maybe 3 times a week, always with a book, always alone. It took me 2 weeks to work up the nerve to try again. This time I asked her about her book, whether she preferred reading in English or Vietnamese. She told me she was a freelance translator, that she read in both languages, but preferred English for novels, because the Vietnamese translations often missed nuances. We talked for maybe 10 minutes before she politely excused herself and left. But it was progress. The next time I saw her, she nodded in recognition. The time after that, she asked if I wanted to share her table since the cafe was crowded. That's how it started. These small, careful conversations over morning coffee. She told me about growing up in Hanoi, about her parents who lived on the outskirts of the city in a cramped apartment. Her father had been a high school literature teacher before he retired. Her mother sold flowers at a market stall near Zhengshun. She spoke about them with this genuine warmth that I hadn't heard in years. When I told her about my divorce, she listened without judgment, without offering unsolicited advice, without making me feel pathetic. She just nodded and said relationships were complicated, that sometimes people grew in different directions. It was such a simple, kind response that I felt something crack open in my chest. We started meeting intentionally instead of accidentally. Coffee became lunch, became dinner. She took me to places I'd never have found on my own, little family-run restaurants in alleyways where the menu was only in Vietnamese, and she'd translate for me, laughing at my attempts to pronounce the dishes. She introduced me to her parents one Sunday afternoon. They lived in a neighborhood I'd never been to, the kind of place where laundry hung between balconies and the streets were too narrow for cars. Their apartment was maybe 40 square meters, 3 people living in a space smaller than my living room. Her father was quiet, dignified, with the careful speech of an educated man who'd lived through hard times. Her mother was tiny and energetic, fussing over me in Vietnamese that Lynn translated, insisting I eat more, asking if I liked Vietnam, treating me with the kind of maternal warmth that made me feel like I might cry. I started bringing groceries when I visited. Small things at first, fruit or bread or a roasted chicken from the market. Lynn would protest, embarrassed, but her mother would beam and pat my arm and chatter at me in Vietnamese. Later, Lynn told me I didn't have to do that they managed fine. But I could see they were struggling. Her father's pension was a joke. Her mother's flower sales barely covered their rent. When I paid for dinner, Lynn would try to split the bill, pulling out her worn wallet with such earnest insistence that I'd have to physically stop her. She never asked for anything. That was the thing that got me. After Petra, who'd measured every gift and every gesture against some invisible scorecard, Lynn's lack of expectation felt like oxygen. She cooked for me, German food, somehow. She'd researched recipes online, asked me what I missed from home, and then showed up at my apartment with ingredients and made schnitzel that wasn't perfect, but was close enough to make me feel seen in a way I hadn't in 20 years. She asked about my work, listened to me explain coding problems with genuine interest, even though she admitted she didn't really understand technology. She'd curl up on my couch after dinner, watching Vietnamese dramas on her phone, occasionally translating funny bits for me. She seemed content with such simple pleasures. No demands for fancy restaurants or expensive gifts, happy with street food and walks around Hoan Kijum Lake at sunset and lying in my air-conditioned apartment escaping the heat. Within 6 months, I asked her to marry me. Not because I was swept away in some grand romance, but because being with her felt like coming home after a lifetime of being lost. She cried when I proposed, told me she'd never expected to find someone who understood her, who respected her family, who treated her like an equal. We got married in a small ceremony at her family's neighborhood temple. Her relatives came, a few of my expat acquaintances showed up, and her mother cried through the entire thing. I sent photos back to Germany. My sister sent a congratulatory message with a barely concealed note of concern. My buddy from university called me, half joking about mail-order brides, and I laughed it off but felt a flicker of irritation. They didn't understand. This wasn't some transactional arrangement. Lynn was educated, independent, self-sufficient. She'd had a life before me and could have one without me. She chose me anyway. She moved into my apartment in Taeho, and the place transformed overnight. Fresh flowers on the table, always. The scent of incense in the mornings. Home-cooked meals waiting when I finished work. She'd greet me with genuine warmth, ask about my day, massage the knots out of my shoulders while I complained about difficult clients. The sex was good, tender, and eager in a way that made me feel desired. For the first time since my early 20s, I felt like I was living instead of just existing. I'd wake up next to her in the mornings, watch her sleep in the gray dawn light filtering through the curtains, and think about how close I'd come to missing this. How if I'd stayed in Germany, nursing my wounds and my bitterness, I'd never have known that this kind of contentment was even possible. I should have known it was too perfect. I should have known that when something feels too good to be true, it usually is. But I was 41 years old, twice burned, desperate for this to be real. So when the first cracks started showing, I told myself I was imagining things. When the requests started coming, small at first, always wrapped in family obligation and cultural context I didn't fully understand, I told myself this was just how things worked here. When money started disappearing faster than it should have, I made excuses. because admitting the truth would have meant admitting I'd been fooled again. And my ego, my battered, pathetic ego, couldn't survive that. The first 6 months of marriage were everything I'd hoped they'd be. Lynn settled into my apartment like she'd always belonged there. She had this way of moving through space that was both efficient and graceful, like she was dancing some slow choreography. Only she knew. Mornings she'd wake before me, and I'd drift awake to the smell of coffee brewing and something cooking in the kitchen. She'd bring me breakfast in bed sometimes. Vietnamese omelets with herbs I couldn't name. French bread from the bakery down the street. Sliced mango arranged on a plate. She never asked for anything in return. Just seemed content to take care of me, to make our home beautiful, to be present in a way Petra never had been, even in the early days. I was working remotely for a Munich-based firm, coding from home, and Lynn would work at the dining table doing her translation projects while I was in the bedroom at my desk. We'd take lunch breaks together, walking down to the lake or ordering in from the local Comtam place she loved. She'd laugh at my terrible attempts to use chopsticks properly, patiently showing me again and again how to hold them. In the evenings, we'd cook together, or she'd cook while I sat at the kitchen counter drinking beer and watching her move around the small space. We'd eat on the balcony when the heat wasn't too oppressive, watching the sunset paint West Lake in colors that seemed impossible. She'd rest her head on my shoulder and tell me about her day, about the difficult client who wanted a technical manual translated by tomorrow, about her mother's gossip from the flower market, about nothing and everything. The sex was good, better than good. Lynn was eager and uninhibited, in a way that made me feel like a younger man. She'd initiate as often as I did, pulling me to the bedroom in the middle of the afternoon or waking me in the night with her hands already exploring. There was none of the scheduled, obligatory quality that had poisoned the last years of my marriage to Petra. This felt wanted, mutual, real. Afterwards, she'd curl against me, tracing patterns on my chest, telling me in her soft voice how happy I made her. How she'd never expected to find someone who understood her so completely. I'd hold her and think about how fucking lucky I was. How I'd stumbled into this second chance at happiness completely by accident. It was about 6 months in when her mother got sick. Lynn came home from visiting her parents one afternoon, and she was quieter than usual, moving through the apartment with this weighted sadness. I asked what was wrong, and she tried to brush it off at first, said it was nothing, but I pressed, and eventually she sat down on the couch and started crying. Her mother's hip had been bothering her for years, she said. Getting worse lately. She could barely walk to the market anymore, had to take Xiom just to get there and back. She needed surgery, something about the joint being damaged, bone grinding on bone. But the procedure was expensive, and her parents had no savings. They'd been trying to manage with pain medication, but her mother was suffering. I asked how much the surgery cost. Lynn looked embarrassed, said she shouldn't have mentioned it, that they'd figure something out. But I pressed. Finally, she told me. 50 million dong. I did the quick math in my head. About $1,900 at the exchange rate. For surgery that would end an old woman's chronic pain. It seemed like nothing to me, sitting in my nice apartment with my German tech salary. I told Lynn I'd cover it. She protested immediately, said she couldn't accept that. It was too much. Her family's problems weren't my responsibility. But I insisted. I wanted to help. Her mother had welcomed me so warmly, fed me, treated me like a son. $1,900 was nothing compared to what this woman had given me by raising Lynn. Lynn cried and held me and told me I was the best man she'd ever known. Her gratitude felt so genuine, so overwhelming, that I felt like a hero. I transferred the money the next day. A week later, Lynn showed me photos of her mother in the hospital, post-surgery, smiling despite the pain. 2 weeks after that, her mother was walking again, slowly, with a cane, but walking. When we visited, she grabbed my hands and spoke to me in rapid Vietnamese, tears streaming down her face. Lynn translated, said her mother was blessing me, thanking Buddha for sending me to their family. I felt 10 feet tall walking out of that cramped apartment. That should have been it. One generous gesture, problem solved, everyone happy. But life doesn't work that way, does it? A month later, Lynn's younger brother needed help. He'd gotten a new job, she explained, at a company on the other side of the city. But he didn't have a motorbike, and the bus route was complicated and unreliable. Could I maybe help him buy a used bike so he could get to work? Nothing fancy, just something reliable. She showed me listings online, bikes going for around 70 million dong, about $2,700. It seemed reasonable. A motorbike in Hanoi wasn't a luxury, it was a necessity. I told her, of course, transferred the money. Her brother sent me a photo on Zalo, grinning next to a blue Honda Wave, thanking me in broken English. Then it was her father's medication. His blood pressure pills had gotten expensive. Something about the pharmacy changing suppliers. Could I help cover a few months' worth? 80 million dong. Then there was a problem with their landlord. Something about a rent increase they couldn't afford. Could I help with the difference for a few months until her mother's flower business picked up? 100 million dong. Then her aunt in the countryside needed help. Some family emergency I didn't fully understand. 120 million dong. Each request came with a detailed explanation, with visible anxiety on Lin's face, with promises that this would be the last time, that her family felt terrible asking, that they'd pay me back as soon as they could. I noticed my savings account was shrinking faster than I'd expected. I'd glance at the balance and feel a little twist in my gut, but then I'd rationalize it. Family obligations were important in Vietnamese culture, I told myself. This was just how things worked here. Lin's family wasn't wealthy like mine had been. They'd lived through war and poverty and decades of hardship I couldn't begin to understand. Helping them was the right thing to do. The generous thing. The amount seemed large in dong, but when I converted them to dollars, they were still manageable. Uncomfortable, but manageable. And Lin's gratitude after each transfer was so profound, so loving, that I felt like I was investing in our relationship as much as I was helping her family. But other things started bothering me. Small things at first. Lin had always been home when I finished work, always there to greet me, always present. But she started disappearing. She'd say she was going to visit her mother or going to the market and then be gone for 3-4 hours. When she came back, she'd have a small bag with maybe some vegetables and a package of meat. Nothing that explained a 4-hour absence. I'd ask if everything was okay with her mother, and she'd say yes, fine, they just talked for a long time. I'd ask what they talked about, and she'd give vague answers. Family stuff. Nothing important. Her tone when I pressed was slightly defensive, slightly irritated, like I was being controlling by asking. Her phone became a locked box. It had always been around, charging on the nightstand or sitting on the kitchen counter. But now she carried it with her everywhere. Bathroom, balcony, even when she went to get water from the kitchen. She'd get messages at odd hours, late at night or early in the morning, and the phone would vibrate on the nightstand, and she'd grab it quickly, read the screen, and either ignore it or take it out to the balcony to respond. When I asked who was messaging her so late, she'd say it was her mother, or a cousin, or a friend from university. Her answers were always plausible, but something in her voice was off. A little too quick, a little too defensive. Money kept disappearing. The requests from her family kept coming, and the amounts kept growing. Her mother needed more medical care. Tests this time. Something about her heart. 200 million dong, about $7,600. Her brother had gotten into some kind of trouble. She was vague about the details, but he owed money to someone, and there would be serious consequences if he didn't pay. Another 250 million dong. Her father's pension had been delayed, and they were behind on bills and facing eviction. 300 million dong, over $11,000 in one transfer. Each time Lin would come to me crying, explaining the crisis with such genuine anguish that I felt like a monster for even hesitating. She'd talk about shame, about how important face was in Vietnamese culture, about how her family would be dishonored if they couldn't pay their debts. She'd cry and apologize and promise this was the last time, that things would get better, that her family felt horrible for burdening me. And here's the thing I'm most ashamed of. After each of these conversations, after I'd transferred the money and soothed her tears, Lin would become the perfect wife again. She'd cook my favorite meals, would be extra attentive in bed, would tell me how much she loved me, how lucky she was, how no other man would be as understanding and generous as I was. The affection felt real. The gratitude felt real. And I needed it to be real so badly that I ignored the pattern. Request, tears, money, affection. Request, tears, money, affection. Over and over like some fucked up behavioral loop. I started lying to myself in increasingly elaborate ways. Maybe her family really was in crisis. Maybe this was just a rough patch and things would stabilize. Maybe I was being paranoid because of my divorce, seeing betrayal where there was only genuine need. Maybe this was just how marriage worked here, extended families supporting each other, and I was the asshole for applying Western individualist standards to an Eastern collectivist culture. I'd read articles online about Vietnamese family values, about filial piety, about the expectation that successful children would support their aging parents. It all sounded reasonable. It all made sense. Except for the gnawing feeling in my gut that something was wrong. My friends back in Germany would ask how married life was going. I'd tell them it was great. I'd send photos of Lynn and me at temples or beaches or restaurants, both of us smiling, looking happy. And we were happy, or at least I was when I wasn't thinking about money. The photos weren't lies, but I left out the part about my savings account bleeding out, about the constant requests, about Lynn's mysterious absences. I left out my growing anxiety, the way I'd wake up at 3 in the morning and lie there calculating how much I'd sent to her family, trying to remember if I'd seen any actual proof of the medical procedures, or the crises, or any of it. I left out the sick feeling when I'd check my bank balance and see another chunk gone. One night, I tried to talk to her about it, not confrontationally, just gently. We were lying in bed, and she was scrolling through her phone, and I said something like, "Hey, I've been thinking about your family's situation. It seems like there's been a lot of emergencies lately. Is everything okay?" She went still for a moment, then put her phone down and looked at me with such hurt in her eyes that I immediately regretted asking. She said of course everything wasn't okay, that her family was struggling, that she felt horrible asking me for help, but what choice did she have? She started crying, saying she understood if I thought she was using me, that maybe she should just go back to her parents and we could separate if I didn't trust her. The guilt hit me like a physical blow. I backpedaled immediately, telling her I didn't mean it like that I was just worried about her and her family, that I'd always help them. She cried harder and said she knew she was a burden, that I deserved better than a wife with such a struggling family. I ended up comforting her, apologizing, promising I'd always be there for her family. That conversation should have been a wake-up call. Instead, it taught me to stop asking questions. Because asking questions made Lynn cry and made me feel like a suspicious asshole, and ended with me apologizing for reasonable concerns. So I stopped. I just transferred money when she asked and tried not to think too hard about the mounting totals. I convinced myself this was temporary, that eventually her family's situation would stabilize, that my generosity now would pay dividends in gratitude and loyalty later. I told myself I was being a good husband, a good son-in-law, a good man. But the disappearances got longer. The phone secrecy got worse. The amounts kept climbing. And somewhere deep down, underneath all my rationalizations and self-deception and desperate need to believe in this marriage, I knew something was very wrong. I just couldn't bring myself to look at it directly, because looking at it would mean seeing the truth, and the truth was that I'd done it again. After Petra, after the divorce, after promising myself I'd never be anyone's fool again, I'd walked right into another trap. This one just had a different face, and a different accent, and a different method of extraction. But a trap is a trap, whether it's disguised as love, or tradition, or family obligation. I wish I could say I figured it out on my own, that I had some moment of clarity where I saw through the lies and confronted her with dignity. But that's not how it happened. The truth came crashing down from the outside, sudden and devastating, when my bank called to tell me my account had been flagged for suspicious activity. And suddenly, all those rationalizations and excuses and carefully constructed lies I'd been telling myself turned to ash in my mouth. The call came on a Wednesday morning. I was at my desk, halfway through debugging some particularly annoying code, when my phone rang with a German number I didn't recognize. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. It was my bank in Munich, their fraud department. The woman on the line was polite but firm. They'd noticed unusual activity on my account, large transfers to foreign accounts over an extended period. Was I aware of these transactions? Was my account secure? I told her yes, I was aware. These were family transfers. Everything was fine. She paused, then said they were required to inform me when patterns emerged that matched common financial fraud scenarios. In the past 14 months, I'd transferred over 1.1 million US dollars equivalent to various Vietnamese bank accounts. 1.1 million. I actually laughed, told her that couldn't be right, there must be some mistake. She read me the transaction history. Dates, amounts, account numbers. My laugh died in my throat. I told her I'd look into it and hung up. I sat there staring at my computer screen without seeing it. $1.1 million. That couldn't be right. I opened my banking app with shaking hands and started scrolling through the transaction history. There it was. Every transfer I'd made laid out in unforgiving detail. 50 million dong here, 80 million there, 200 million, 300 million. I started adding them up properly for the first time, converting each amount to US dollars at the exchange rates from those dates. My stomach dropped further with each calculation, $47,000. The bank had been slightly off, but not by much. 47,000 fucking dollars in 14 months. I sat in my air-conditioned bedroom, listening to the hum of the unit, and feeling like I was going to vomit. $47,000. More than half my savings after the divorce settlement. Gone. I thought about every transfer, every tearful request, every explanation about medical emergencies and family crises and debt and shame. I thought about Lynn's gratitude, her promises that this was the last time, her perfect wife routine after each transfer. And for the first time, I let myself see it clearly without the fog of desperation and loneliness clouding my vision. I'd been played. Completely, thoroughly, expertly played. Lynn was out. At the market, she'd said, probably gone for hours like she always was these days. I sat at my computer and started investigating. First, I called her mother. I used Google Translate on my phone, fumbling through a conversation that was probably incomprehensible on both ends. But I managed to ask about her hip surgery, about her health. There was a long, confused pause. Her mother said something rapid in Vietnamese. I caught the word for hospital, the word for no. She sounded bewildered. I thanked her and hung up, my hands trembling so badly I nearly dropped the phone. Next, I went to Facebook, found Lynn's younger brother's profile. We'd never really talked beyond him thanking me for the motorbike, but I sent him a message in English anyway. Said I was worried about Lynn, asked if everything was okay with the family, mentioned I'd heard there had been some financial troubles. He responded faster than I expected. His English was broken but understandable enough. He said he hadn't spoken to Lynn in over a year, that she'd brought shame to the family, that their parents were heartbroken. When I pressed him about what kind of shame, there was a long pause. Then he typed out a response that made the room spin around me. Lynn has gambling problem. Very bad. She owe much money to bad people. Family try to help, but she lie and steal from us too. We cut her off 2 years ago. We tell her get help or stay away. She stay away. I think she find foreign boyfriend to use. I am sorry. She is sick. Family very ashamed. I read it 3 times. 4 times. 5. Gambling problem. Bad enough that her family had cut her off 2 years ago. Before I'd even met her, that whole narrative about the close-knit family, the devoted daughter, the aging parents she cared for so deeply, all of it was fiction. I thought about those Sunday visits to her parents, the warmth of her mother's greeting, her father's quiet dignity. Had they even known we were married? Or had Lynn staged those visits like movie scenes, bringing me to their door and playing the dutiful daughter for a few hours before disappearing back into whatever hole she'd dug for herself? I asked her brother if he knew what kind of gambling. He said mostly cards, underground casinos, online betting. She gambled away her own savings, borrowed from family, borrowed from loan sharks, got banned from several legal casinos in Hanoi for owing money. The family had tried to help, paid her debts once, but she'd gone right back to it. Eventually, they'd had to choose between enabling her addiction and protecting themselves. They chose survival. They still loved her, but they couldn't watch her destroy herself and drag them down with her. I thanked him, apologized for bringing up painful family history, and sat there staring at my computer screen as the afternoon sun moved across the floor. Gambling addiction. Every dong I'd given her had gone straight into feeding that addiction. The sick mother, the brother's motorbike, the father's medication, the family debts, all of it lies. Elaborate, detailed, emotionally manipulative lies designed to extract money from a lonely foreign man, desperate to believe he'd found something real. I started laughing. Not because anything was funny, but because the alternative was screaming or crying or putting my fist through the wall. I'd done it again. After Petra, after the divorce, after promising myself I'd never be anyone's fool again, I'd walked right into an even worse trap. At least Petra had genuinely loved me once, however briefly, before we'd settled into bitter cohabitation. Lynn had never loved me at all. I was a mark from day one. That shy woman reading Garcia Marquez at the coffee shop, was that even real? Or had she been scouting for her next victim, playing the part of the cultured, disinterested intellectual to hook a certain type of lonely expat? How many men had she run this con on before me? The door opened and Lynn came in carrying a small bag of vegetables. She called out a cheerful greeting, something about finding good tomatoes at the market. I heard her moving around the kitchen, putting things away. My whole body felt numb. I stood up and walked to the living room. She was standing by the refrigerator, still wearing her conical hat, and when she saw my face, she smiled and asked what was wrong. I told her to sit down. She did, slowly, her smile fading as she read something in my expression. I asked her about her mother's hip surgery. She started to answer, some story about the recovery going well, but I cut her off. I told her I'd called her mother an hour ago. Lynn went very still. I asked her about her brother's motorbike, about her father's medication, about every single crisis and emergency she'd brought to me over the past year. With each question, her face got paler. Finally, I asked her what the money was really for. She tried lying at first, said I must have misunderstood her mother on the phone, that her English was terrible, that there was some confusion. But I told her I'd also talked to her brother. That was when something broke in her face. She started crying, big gasping sobs that shook her whole body. She admitted it, all of it. The gambling addiction that had started years ago, small bets at first, just for fun, then bigger stakes, then chasing losses, then borrowing money, then owing money to people who didn't accept excuses. She'd lost everything before meeting me. Her savings, her family's money, her family's respect. She'd been banned from casinos, blacklisted by legitimate lenders, trapped in a cycle of debt to underground operations that charged interest rates that would make a loan shark blush. Meeting me was her salvation, she said through her tears, her way out. She'd been scouting coffee shops in expat areas, looking for someone, anyone, who might help. When she saw me that first day, alone and obviously foreign, and reading on a tablet, she'd grabbed the English book she kept in her bag for exactly this purpose. She'd played it perfectly. The disinterest, the slow warming, the introduction to her family, who she'd told I was just a friend, who might help with some money. They'd gone along with it at first, desperate enough to accept help from anywhere, but when they'd realized the extent of her manipulation, they'd cut her off completely. Everything after that was her acting alone, using me to feed her addiction and service her debts. She swore she'd meant to stop. Every time I gave her money, she'd tell herself this was the last time, that she'd use it to pay off her debts and get clean and quit. But gambling addiction doesn't work like that. She'd pay some debts and then convince herself one more bet would solve everything, one more hand of cards, one more spin. She'd win sometimes, and that would make it worse, because then she'd believe she could win it all back, could pay me back, could make everything right. But she never won enough. The house always wins. The debts kept growing, and she kept losing, and she kept needing more money from me to stay ahead of the people who would hurt her if she didn't pay. She said she did love me. That part was real. She hadn't expected to love me, but somewhere along the way she had, genuinely, which made the lying harder, but also impossible to stop, because admitting the truth meant losing me. She'd been trapped between her addiction and her feelings for me, and the addiction always won because addiction always wins. She was sick, she said. She needed help. She wanted to get help. She'd go to counseling, go to meetings, whatever I wanted, if I'd just give her one more chance. I sat there listening to her sob and watching her mascara run down her face and feeling absolutely nothing. No anger, no sadness, just this vast, empty numbness spreading through my chest. I thought about the $47,000. I thought about the months of lies, the performance of the perfect wife, the calculated manipulation. I thought about how desperately I'd wanted to believe in her, how I'd ignored every red flag and rationalized every inconsistency because the alternative was admitting I'd been fooled again. I thought about how she'd used my loneliness as a weapon against me, had identified my exact vulnerabilities and exploited them with surgical precision. The worst part wasn't even the money or the lies. The worst part was realizing that some part of me had known all along. Deep down, underneath all the rationalizations and self-deception, I'd known something was wrong, and I'd chosen to ignore it because being with her, even being used by her, felt better than being alone. I'd traded my self-respect for the illusion of companionship. I'd let myself be a mark because being a mark with someone felt less pathetic than being alone. I told her to pack her things and leave. She begged. Got on her knees, literally, grabbed my hands, swore she'd change, promised she'd never gamble again, said she'd get a job and pay me back every dong. She tried everything: tears, apologies, anger, accusations that I was abandoning her when she needed help most, back to tears. I watched it all with that same numb distance, like I was watching a performance I'd seen too many times before. Different actress, same script. Petra had done the same thing when I discovered her affair, cycling through every emotional manipulation in the book trying to avoid consequences. I told her I'd give her money for a hotel for a week, but after that, she was on her own. She could take her clothes and personal items, but everything else stayed. I'd change the locks tomorrow. She called me cruel, heartless, said I was abandoning her to the loan sharks who had hurt her or worse. I told her that wasn't my problem anymore. She'd made her choices, and now she'd have to live with the consequences. I was done being her salvation, done being her ATM, done being her mark. She packed a bag, still crying, still trying to talk to me, still insisting that she loved me and that this was a mistake and that we could work through this. I sat on the couch and watched her move through the apartment collecting her things and felt like I was watching a stranger. This woman I'd shared a bed with, cooked with, built a life with for over a year. I didn't know her at all. The Lynn I'd loved never existed. She was a character this gambling addict had created to con a lonely divorced man out of his money. The real Lynn was whoever this crying woman in my apartment was, and I had no interest in knowing her. She left around sunset, stood in the doorway with her bag, mascara smeared, eyes red, and asked one more time if I was sure. I said yes. She nodded, said she was sorry, said she hoped I'd find happiness, and left. I locked the door behind her and stood there in my apartment that suddenly felt too big and too empty. The fresh flowers she'd put out that morning were still on the table. Her slippers were still by the door. The scent of her perfume still lingered in the air. Everywhere I looked, I saw traces of the life we'd built together, the life that had never been real. I poured myself a beer and went out to the balcony. Westlake was turning gold in the sunset, motorbikes buzzing below, the city settling into evening. I thought about the $47,000. I thought about my empty savings account. I thought about going back to Germany with nothing to show for 2 years in Vietnam, except debt, and another failed relationship, and an even deeper inability to trust anyone. I thought about how I'd ignored every warning sign because I'd wanted so desperately to believe that this time was different, that I'd finally found someone who wanted me for me and not for what I could provide. The truth is, Lynn didn't trap me. I trapped myself. She just provided the opportunity. I was the one who ignored the red flags. I was the one who made excuse after excuse. I was the one who chose to believe in her because believing in her was easier than facing the possibility that I was alone and might stay that alone. She was sick, an addict, and addicts do what they do to feed their addiction. But I was supposed to be the rational one, the one with perspective, the one who'd learned from past mistakes. Instead, I walked eyes wide open into exactly the same trap I'd escaped from in Germany, just dressed up in different clothes, speaking a different language. I sat on that balcony until the beer got warm and the sun disappeared completely and the city lights came on below. I thought about trust, about how I'd probably never be able to trust anyone fully again, romantic or otherwise. Every kind gesture would be scrutinized for ulterior motives. Every request for help would trigger suspicion. Every new person in my life would be measured against the template of betrayal that Petra and now Lynn had created. I'd become one of those bitter expats you meet in bars, the ones who talk about all women being gold diggers and all relationships being transactional, the ones younger guys roll their eyes at and older guys nod knowingly with. I'd become the cautionary tale, but maybe that was okay. Maybe that was just the price of protection. Maybe never trusting anyone again was better than being someone's mark for the third time. I'd return to Germany soon, rebuild my savings, get back to my life. I'd be fine. People bounce back from worse. The money was just money. The time was just time. The humiliation would fade eventually. I'd learned to live with the loneliness, with the suspicion, with the guard that would never fully come down again. It wouldn't be the life I'd wanted, but it would be a life. And at 42 years old, maybe that was the best I could hope for. The host's voice comes back in to close the story. Thank you for listening to Marcus's story. If you've been through something similar, if you've ignored red flags because you wanted to believe, if you've let loneliness make you vulnerable to manipulation, you're not alone. Drop a comment below sharing your experience. And remember, these cautionary tales aren't just entertainment. They're lessons learned the hard way, so hopefully others won't have to learn them the same way. Until next time, stay safe out there.